The dust of Grey Hollow settled on everything, a fine, persistent powder that coated not just the land, but the very soul of its inhabitants. For Elijah Carver, it was a shroud. He was a man carved from the harsh realities of a life that had dealt him a bitter hand, a life defined by the echoing silence of his father's absence and the suffocating weight of his mother's unspoken truths. His youth had been a landscape of barren fields and unfulfilled promises, a testament to a legacy tainted by betrayal and misunderstanding. He had inherited not wealth, but a gnawing resentment, a bitter harvest sown by a father he barely knew, and a mother who guarded her own pain with a fierce, unyielding silence. His world was a monochromatic existence, drained of color and joy, a testament to a past that refused to remain buried. The shame of the barn fire, a searing memory that had branded his young life, had cemented his identity as the wronged, the abandoned, the son of a broken promise. He walked through his days with the heavy cloak of a perpetual victim, his gaze fixed on the ground, on the dry, unyielding soil of Grey Hollow, a reflection of the aridness within his own spirit. The very air he breathed seemed thick with the ghosts of his past, each gust of wind whispering accusations and regrets. He was a man defined by what he lacked, an inheritance, a father's guidance, a mother's open heart, and a sense of belonging. His marriage to June was a quiet pact, a shared existence built on the brittle foundation of unspoken grievances. A life where love was a carefully guarded commodity, rationed out in hushed tones and averted glances. Their son, a silent observer of his father's internal turmoil, moved through their lives like a shadow, a constant unspoken reminder of the emotional chasm that separated Elijah from his own family. The land itself, a legacy of loss, was a constant physical manifestation of his father's perceived betrayal, a daily reminder of what had been taken, of what had been promised, and then cruelly withheld. Every sunrise in Grey Hollow brought with it the chilling echo of a past he couldn't escape, a past that held him captive in its unforgiving grip. He was a prisoner of his own narrative, a story he had meticulously constructed to shield himself from a truth too devastating to confront, a truth that lay buried beneath layers of anger and self-deception. The creek, a sluggish, muddy artery of the parched land, had always been a place of quiet contemplation for Elijah. It was there, amidst the gnarled roots of ancient willows and the whisper of reeds, that he often sought refuge from the relentless weight of his existence. But on this particular morning, the familiar tranquility was shattered by an unexpected, unwelcome sight. Half submerged in the shallow water, his face a mask of pain and delirium, lay Reuben Slade. The name itself was a jolt, a visceral reminder of the barn fire, of the betrayal that had cleaved his family in two, of the man who had been both his father's confidant and his perceived usurper. Reuben was a spectre from a past Elijah had tried to exorcise, a living embodiment of the injustice that had shaped his entire life. He was gaunt, withered, a shadow of the man he might have been, yet the scent of the earth, the very earth he had taken, still clung to him, a taunting reminder of what had been lost. The old wound in Elijah's own heart, the one that had never truly healed, throbbed with renewed intensity, a physical manifestation of the lingering bitterness. June's voice, a low murmur of practicality and caution, had urged him to leave the man to his fate. "He left you with nothing, Elijah," she had said, her words a pragmatic dismissal of any obligation. "Dry land and debt, you owe him no kindness." But something deeper, something rooted in a complex tapestry of pride and a nascent, almost involuntary sense of obligation, compelled Elijah to act. It was not compassion, not yet, but a grim, almost morbid fascination, a need to confront the ghost that haunted his inheritance. Dragging Reuben to the skeletal remains of the old barn, a structure that bore the scars of the fire that had defined Elijah's youth, felt like tending to a festering wound, a necessary act of acknowledging the pain, even if it meant prolonging its agony. He cared for Reuben in the oppressive silence of his own resentment, a silent caretaker of a memory he could not bear to let die, a memory that refused to fade into insignificance. The nights were the worst. In the fevered haze of his delirium, Reuben's words became a fragmented confession, a jumble of names that echoed in the cavernous space of the barn. The names of Elijah's father, his mother, and another, an unknown entity named Abigail, swirled in the darkness, a spectral chorus of a life lived in the shadows. It was as if Reuben was conversing with the very phantoms that plagued Elijah's waking hours, a haunting symphony of unresolved regrets and whispered secrets. The air grew heavy with unspoken truths, with the weight of a history that was slowly, inexorably, beginning to unravel. Each mumbled word from the injured man was a thread pulled from the tightly woven fabric of Elijah's perceived reality, a subtle unraveling that promised to reveal a far more complex and painful truth than he had ever dared to imagine. The quiet desperation in Reuben's voice, the raw vulnerability exposed in his unconscious state, began to chip away at the hardened shell Elijah had built around his heart. A shell designed to protect him from further pain, but which had, in fact, become his prison. The first tangible crack in Elijah's carefully constructed world appeared with the discovery of a letter, a fragile artifact unearthed from Reuben's worn jacket. It was addressed to him, penned by his father's hand, a voice from the grave that carried the weight of revelation. The words spoke of Reuben's attempts to return the land, to attend his father's funeral, only to be thwarted by Elijah's own mother. "Protect Elijah from the world, but not from himself," the letter implored, a plea that struck Elijah with the force of a physical blow. It was a stark contradiction to the narrative he had clung to, the story of Reuben's abandonment, of his mother's unwavering loyalty. The implication was chilling. His mother, the steadfast bastion of his fractured family, had been the architect of his isolation, the curator of his resentment. For the first time, a seed of doubt was sown, a terrifying possibility that he, Elijah Carver, might not be the righteous victim he had always believed himself to be, but rather the unwitting antagonist in a drama far more complex than he had ever conceived. This nascent realization was the first tremor, the subtle shift that would precede the seismic upheaval of his entire existence. The world, once a simple equation of right and wrong, was beginning to blur, its stark lines dissolving into a spectrum of shades he had never allowed himself to see. The man in the barn stirred. His eyes, clouded with fever but undeniably present, found Elijah's. A raspy whisper, barely audible, escaped his lips, a single word that resonated with an unexpected familiarity. "Son." It was a label that had been absent from Elijah's life for as long as he could remember, a term of endearment that now felt both alien and deeply significant. The utterance, a fragile bridge across the chasm of years and animosity, hung in the air, a silent question, a plea for acknowledgement. It was a moment suspended in time, a fragile offering of connection in the desolate landscape of Elijah's emotional desolation. The weight of unspoken history pressed down, and for the first time, Elijah felt the stirrings of something other than resentment. The air in the barn, thick with the scent of hay and the metallic tang of old wounds, seemed to hold its breath. Reuben, his grip surprisingly firm on Elijah's arm, his eyes now holding a clarity that belied his physical state, spoke words that struck at the very core of Elijah's identity. "You're more like your father than you realize," he rasped, his voice a dry rustle. "I saved you from his resentment, and now you're saving me from yours." The statement was a mirror held up to Elijah's soul, reflecting back an image he had long refused to acknowledge. A man burdened by the same pride, the same stubborn refusal to confront his own emotional landscape. Reuben's words, laced with a weary wisdom, pointed not to an external enemy, but to an internal one, a foe that resided within the confines of Elijah's own heart. The realization was stark, The narrative of victimhood he had so carefully curated was not a shield, but a cage, and Reuben, the supposed villain of his story, was offering him the key. As days bled into weeks and Reuben's strength slowly returned, a disquieting pattern emerged. Elijah found himself observing Reuben, not with the expected animosity, but with a growing, uncomfortable recognition. In Reuben's hesitant smiles, in the way he deflected direct questions with a practiced sarcasm, in his almost compulsive need to push away any offered kindness, Elijah saw a distorted reflection of himself. It was the pride that masked regret, the carefully constructed defenses that shielded a vulnerable core, the fear of vulnerability that led to pushing away the very people who offered solace. Reuben was an emotional mirror, and the image staring back was one Elijah loathed. He began to question the foundations of his own identity, the cost of his long-held bitterness. He saw the impact of his internal war on June, her quiet weariness, and on his son, whose gaze often passed over him as if he were merely a piece of furniture. The silence in their home, once a comfortable quietude, had become a suffocating void, filled with the unspoken weight of Elijah's emotional absence. He was starving his family and himself with his refusal to let go of a past that was slowly consuming him. Then came the storm, a tempest that mirrored the brewing turmoil within the barn. As the wind howled and rain lashed against the weathered wood, Reuben, his voice low and heavy with the burden of years, finally revealed the truth about Abigail. She was his sister, his father's daughter from a life lived before Elijah's mother, a secret kept buried for decades. Reuben, it turned out, was not the usurper but the godfather, entrusted with the care of this hidden half-sister, a responsibility that was part of the original inheritance. The pieces clicked into place with brutal clarity. Elijah's mother had known. She had manipulated the will, burning portions of it, and had perpetuated the lie of Reuben's abandonment. The man Elijah had demonized, the man he had spent a lifetime hating, was in fact the only one who had tried to protect his innocence, to shield him from a truth that would have shattered his world. The betrayal was not Reuben's, it was his mother's. And in a devastating twist of fate, Elijah had spent his life punishing the wrong man, a man who had, in his own misguided way, tried to preserve his son's childhood. This revelation was not just a turning point, it was an earthquake, the ground shifting beneath Elijah's feet, forcing him to confront the devastating reality that his entire life had been built on a foundation of lies, perpetuated by the very person he had trusted most. The weight of this truth settled upon Elijah, heavy and suffocating. The storm raged outside, a fitting backdrop to the tempest within him. Reuben, his voice barely a whisper against the wind's fury, continued to unravel the tangled threads of their shared past, each word a further dismantling of Elijah's carefully constructed reality. He spoke of his father's deep regret, of his love for both women, a love that was a source of torment rather than joy. He explained his own silence, a desperate attempt to shield Elijah from the devastating truth, a truth that would have irrevocably altered the trajectory of his young life. Reuben's narrative was not one of malice, but of a desperate, flawed attempt at protection, an act of loyalty to a dying friend that had, ironically, resulted in years of animosity. The shame of the barn fire, once a source of righteous anger, now felt like a hollow echo, a consequence of a misunderstanding that had festered into a consuming hatred. Elijah realized with a sickening certainty that he had been so consumed by his own pain, his own perceived injustices, that he had become blind to the possibility of any other truth. He had been so intent on being the wronged party that he had refused to see the complexities, the shades of gray that painted the lives of the people he thought he knew. The premature birth of June's daughter, a fragile life entering the world under a sky bruised with storm clouds, became the next seismic event in Elijah's unraveling life. The fear that gripped him as June labored, her strength ebbing away with each passing moment, was a primal terror, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the profound responsibility he carried. The desperate search for help, the agonizing realization that the nearest doctor was miles away, amplified his sense of helplessness. It was Reuben, the man he had come to despise, the man he had grudgingly taken into his barn, who emerged as an unlikely savior. Despite his still healing leg, despite the pain etched on his face, Reuben mounted the old horse, a desperate gallop against the encroaching darkness. He returned with the midwife, his own wounds bleeding anew, a testament to a courage that defied his physical limitations. In that moment, Reuben was not the villain of Elijah's story, but a man driven by a deeply ingrained sense of duty, a man who, despite being cast out and wronged, still possessed a profound capacity for compassion. He had saved the life of the woman who had once wished him harm, and in doing so had inadvertently begun to save Elijah from himself. The act was a silent, powerful refutation of Elijah's bitter narrative, a stark reminder that true strength often lay not in holding on to grudges, but in extending a hand, even to an enemy. The third and most profound turning point arrived with the dawning of a new day, a day that would irrevocably alter the landscape of Elijah's soul. He found the barn empty. The rough straw mattress where Reuben had lain was undisturbed, the blanket folded neatly, a silent testament to a departure. But on the hay, a single folded leaf, a final message from the man he had both nursed and resented. The words, stark and simple, pierced through the layers of Elijah's hardened heart. "My silence was my biggest mistake. May my departure be your new beginning. Abigail is alive in Laredo. Go, son, tell her who you are and forgive your father. He was a good man caught between two loves." Reuben was gone, and with him, the chance for Elijah to seek his own forgiveness. But the opportunity to forgive, that remained. In that quiet, solitary moment surrounded by the ghosts of his past, Elijah understood. The true adversary was not Reuben nor his mother, but the narrative he had woven around his own pain, the story he had clung to as a shield, a story that had kept him captive for so long. The greatest revelation was not about Reuben or his father or even his mother, but about himself. He had been the jailer of his own grief, the architect of his own emotional prison, and the key, the power to unlock the chains, had resided within him all along. Weeks later, under a sky that held the promise of a new season, Elijah set off for Laredo. In his arms, nestled against his chest, was his newborn daughter, a tiny, perfect symbol of hope and renewal. The journey was not merely a physical one, but a pilgrimage towards a truth long buried. He found Abigail, her resemblance to him uncanny, a mirror reflecting his own fiery hair and shadowed eyes. She spoke of a quiet awareness, a sense that he existed, but a hesitation, a doubt about whether she could or should reach out. In that meeting, the final pieces of the fractured puzzle of his past fell into place. He forgave his mother, not with words, but with a silent, profound gesture. He placed a photograph of her in Abigail's hands, a tangible link between the two women who had shaped his life, a symbol that marked not an end, but a beginning. The weight of years of unspoken resentment began to lift, replaced by a quiet understanding, a nascent peace. The greatest obstacle had not been the physical journey to find Abigail, nor the arduous task of nursing Reuben back to health. It had been the monumental effort of releasing the suffocating grip of the past, of letting go of the narrative that had defined him, the story that had dictated his every thought and action. His second significant challenge lay in confronting June, in admitting the ruptures his silence had caused, the emotional distance his bitterness had fostered. Her forgiveness was not immediate, not a swift absolution, but a gradual unfurling, a slow bloom of trust and understanding that came in shared glances, in quiet tears, in the simple, profound act of holding hands in the darkness. their unspoken connection a testament to their enduring love. It was a reconciliation built not on grand declarations, but on the quiet, consistent rebuilding of a shared life. Today, Elijah stands on the land, the soil still dry, but no longer barren. It is fertile ground, ready to receive the seeds of a new beginning. Abigail visits, her presence a gentle reminder of the family he never knew he had. His daughter grows, her laughter echoing through the quiet fields, a melody of innocence and joy. She hears stories, not of villains and victims, but of two men, flawed and human, who stumbled and erred in their attempts to love. And as the sun rises, painting the sky with hues of hope and redemption, Elijah remembers what he has left behind. Not land, not money, but the emotional prison that had held him captive for so long. It was a freedom earned not through vengeance, but through the quiet, persistent act of confronting his own truth. It all began with a simple act, an almost involuntary gesture, saving a man. But in the quiet solitude of that early morning, as the frost still etched its delicate patterns across the parched earth, Elijah Carver, the man who had believed himself to be the poorest in Grey Hollow, had saved something far more precious. He had saved himself. He had unearthed the man he was before the shame, before the bitterness had taken root, and in doing so had finally found his way home. The sound of horses approaching at sunrise, once a harbinger of dread, now signaled not loss, but return. They had come to take, but in the end, they had brought back everything that truly mattered. The initial act of saving Reuben, a seemingly straightforward intervention, had been the catalyst for Elijah's profound internal excavation. What began as a reluctant obligation soon evolved into an unexpected exploration of his own emotional architecture. This process wasn't merely about confronting past hurts, it was about actively dismantling the very mechanisms he had employed to shield himself. The meticulous construction of his victimhood, a narrative built brick by painstaking brick from perceived injustices, began to crumble not under external pressure, but from the internal realization of its own inadequacy. He recognized that the energy once devoted to maintaining this edifice of self-pity could be repurposed, redirected towards a more constructive engagement with his present reality. Consider how this applies when you find yourself dwelling on a past slight. The very act of analyzing its impact, of understanding its roots, can paradoxically diminish its power over your current actions. Furthermore, the revelation of his mother's complicity and Reuben's true role necessitated a radical re-evaluation of his entire life's narrative. This wasn't simply a matter of updating facts. It was a fundamental restructuring of his understanding of cause and effect, of loyalty and betrayal. The deeply ingrained belief that Reuben was the sole antagonist was replaced by the complex, often uncomfortable truth of his mother's motivations, a tapestry woven from fear, misguided protection, and her own unaddressed pain. This forced Elijah to acknowledge that human actions, even those that cause immense suffering, are rarely born of pure malice. They are often the product of intricate, intersecting circumstances, personal histories, and deeply ingrained emotional patterns. Consequently, the simplistic black and white view of his past gave way to a more nuanced, grayscale understanding of human nature, including his own. The quiet act of tending to Reuben's wounds became a metaphor for Elijah's own internal healing. Just as he meticulously cleaned and dressed Reuben's physical injuries, he began to address the festering wounds of his own spirit. This involved a deliberate practice of self-compassion, a concept entirely foreign to his previous worldview. He started to view his past mistakes not as indelible stains, but as learning experiences, albeit painful ones. The internal dialogue shifted from self-recrimination to a more objective, analytical approach. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" he began to inquire, "What can I learn from this and how can I move forward?" This subtle yet significant shift in perspective was crucial, transforming him from a passive recipient of misfortune into an active participant in his own emotional recovery. Building on this newfound self-awareness, Elijah recognized that his prolonged silence had not only isolated him, but had also created a void in his relationships. His interactions with June and his son were marked by an emotional deficit, a consequence of his unwillingness to share his inner turmoil. The reconciliation with June, therefore, was not merely about apologizing for past wrongs. It was about actively learning to communicate his vulnerabilities, to bridge the emotional chasm that his silence had created. This involved a conscious effort to express his feelings, to articulate his fears and regrets, even when it felt awkward or exposed. It was a gradual process, marked by hesitant conversations and tentative gestures, but each honest exchange chipped away at the wall of isolation he had inadvertently built around himself. Moreover, the journey to Laredo and the subsequent meeting with Abigail represented a literal and symbolic embrace of a broader family narrative. Discovering Abigail wasn't just about finding a lost sibling. It was about integrating a previously unknown branch into the tree of his identity. This act of inclusion challenged the exclusivity of his grief, demonstrating that love and connection could expand to encompass unexpected relationships. It illustrated a vital principle, that acknowledging and integrating all aspects of one's heritage, even the parts that were hidden or uncomfortable, leads to a more complete and resilient sense of self. This expansion of his emotional landscape allowed him to see that his father's love, though divided, was not diminished, but rather a complex testament to a life lived with profound, albeit conflicted, emotion. The journey to Laredo represented more than just a physical relocation. It was an active engagement with the fractured pieces of his identity. Upon arrival, Elijah didn't immediately seek out Abigail. Instead, he first sought out the town's historical society, a quiet institution dedicated to preserving the local past. He spent days poring over old town records, property deeds, and newspaper archives. This wasn't a quest for vindication, but for context. He needed to understand the broader societal framework within which his father's dual life had existed, to see the historical currents that might have influenced such complex relationships. For instance, he discovered that in that era and region, societal pressures often dictated discrete arrangements for unconventional families, creating a network of quiet complicity and maintained appearances that often masked significant personal dramas. This research provided a vital layer of understanding, moving beyond the personal betrayal to grasp the systemic factors that may have contributed to the secrecy. It was an application of historical empathy, a way to humanize the circumstances that had led to his family's fractured state, rather than simply condemning the individuals involved. When he finally located Abigail, it wasn't through a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet introduction at a local market. He approached her not with an accusation or a demand for acknowledgement, but with a simple, observant greeting, noting the familiar curve of her brow, a detail he recognized from a faded photograph of his father's childhood. This subtle approach allowed Abigail to process his presence without immediate defensiveness. He presented himself not as a wronged son seeking restitution, but as a fellow traveler on the path of understanding their shared paternal legacy. He shared anecdotes about his father, small, intimate details that painted a picture of a man wrestling with his own desires and societal expectations rather than a simple betrayer. This indirect method of revealing their connection allowed Abigail to absorb the information at her own pace, fostering a sense of shared discovery rather than imposed revelation. It mirrored how one might approach a delicate plant, offering gentle sunlight and water rather than harsh pruning, allowing it to grow naturally. The act of leaving his mother's photograph with Abigail was a symbolic severance, not of his connection to his mother, but of the unhealthy clinging to her narrative as the sole source of his identity. This gesture was an acknowledgement that his mother's story, while significant, was not the entirety of his own. It was an act of emotional maturity, recognizing that his identity was not solely defined by her experiences or her pain. Consider how this applies when you find yourself overly reliant on the validation or interpretation of one person to understand your own worth. This action demonstrates the importance of broadening your perspective and finding validation from multiple sources, including your own internal compass. It was a declaration that his past, while influential, did not dictate his future. This was not about abandoning his mother, but about reclaiming his own narrative, about asserting his autonomy from the emotional inheritance that had, until then, dictated his path. Furthermore, the very act of seeking out Abigail was an exercise in confronting his own fear of rejection. He'd spent years building a narrative where he was the wronged party, and the potential for Abigail to confirm his mother's version of events or to simply not reciprocate his overtures was a deeply unsettling prospect. By proceeding despite this apprehension, he demonstrated a commitment to truth over comfort, to the potential for genuine connection over the safety of his familiar isolation. This mirrors situations where the fear of awkwardness or misunderstanding might prevent you from reaching out to a colleague or a distant relative. Elijah's actions illustrate the potential rewards of pushing past that initial discomfort for the sake of authentic engagement. He chose the possibility of a richer, more complex understanding of himself and his family, even at the risk of emotional vulnerability. This was a deliberate choice to engage with the world and with his own multifaceted identity, rather than retreating into the confines of a self-imposed narrative. The process of integrating Abigail into Elijah's life was not a seamless merger, but a delicate negotiation of shared history and nascent understanding. It involved navigating the unspoken currents of their father's divided affections and the lingering shadows of their mother's separate experiences. Elijah found that his initial assumptions about Abigail's life were incomplete. Her existence was not merely a consequence of his father's infidelity, but a complex tapestry woven with her own unique challenges and perspectives. For instance, he learned that Abigail had grown up in a community that, while aware of her father's dual life, largely ostracized her, viewing her as an outsider, a living testament to a societal transgression. This experience had fostered a deep sense of self-reliance in her, a quiet resilience that mirrored Elijah's own, but stemmed from different origins. It underscored the idea that shared parentage did not automatically equate to shared lived experiences, highlighting the crucial distinction between biological connection and the shaping forces of individual environments. Furthermore, Elijah discovered that his father's attempts to provide for Abigail were not always perceived as benevolent gestures by those around her. There were instances where the financial support was viewed with suspicion, as if it were a form of compensation for a moral failing, rather than a genuine expression of paternal responsibility. This perspective added another layer of complexity to Elijah's understanding, revealing that the impact of past actions could be interpreted and felt in vastly different ways by those involved. Consider how this applies when a well-intentioned gift is received with an undercurrent of obligation or suspicion. It highlights the importance of understanding the recipient's context and perspective, ensuring that the act of giving is perceived as intended, free from the baggage of past resentments or societal judgments. Elijah began to realize that his father's legacy was not a simple inheritance of property or name, but a complex web of emotional and financial entanglements that extended far beyond his own immediate family. The reconciliation with June, while progressing, required a sustained effort to actively demonstrate his commitment to a more open and communicative partnership. This involved not just apologizing for past silences, but proactively sharing his thoughts and feelings, even when they were uncomfortable or uncertain. For example, he made a conscious effort to discuss his anxieties about raising his daughter, not as pronouncements of wisdom, but as shared vulnerabilities, inviting June's input and perspective. This practice of mutual disclosure fostered a deeper sense of intimacy, transforming their relationship from one of shared existence to one of shared emotional exploration. It's akin to how a gardener meticulously tends to a delicate vine, providing consistent support and nourishment to ensure its healthy growth and prevent it from withering. This ongoing dialogue allowed them to navigate the complexities of their shared past and build a stronger foundation for their future together. Moreover, Elijah's interactions with his son began to shift from passive observation to active engagement. He realized that his son's quietness was not necessarily a lack of emotion, but perhaps a reflection of the emotional climate he had grown up in. He started initiating conversations, not about grand pronouncements or life lessons, but about simple, everyday observations about the boy's interests and curiosities. He learned, for instance, that his son harbored a fascination with the constellations, a detail Elijah had never noticed amidst his own internal preoccupation. This opened a new avenue for connection, a shared interest that transcended the burdened history of their family. It illustrated that genuine connection often arises from a sincere interest in the other person's world, a willingness to step outside one's own perspective and explore theirs. This deliberate shift in focus allowed Elijah to see his son not as a silent indictment of his failings, but as an individual with his own unique inner life, deserving of attention and genuine curiosity. Reflecting on this journey so far, one can discern a profound shift in perspective, a recalibration of deeply ingrained beliefs. The initial landscape, once starkly defined by perceived injustices and the heavy mantle of a singular, unforgiving narrative, has gradually yielded to a more intricate and nuanced understanding of human experience. The very act of confronting the past, not as a static entity to be endured, but as a dynamic force to be reinterpreted, has unlocked unforeseen pathways toward personal liberation. It's akin to a cartographer meticulously redrawing a map, not to erase the old landmarks, but to reveal the hidden routes and uncharted territories that lie beyond familiar boundaries. This process of re-evaluation, of looking beyond the immediate contours of personal grievance, has illuminated the interconnectedness of individual actions and their far-reaching consequences, not just on others, but on the very fabric of one's own inner world. In light of these insights, the path forward becomes clearer, not as a preordained destination, but as a landscape of emergent possibilities. The weight of unspoken burdens, once a crushing force, has begun to dissipate, replaced by the quiet strength that arises from authentic self-expression and the courage to extend understanding. The realization that personal narratives, however compelling, are not immutable truths, but rather chosen interpretations, has empowered a fundamental reorientation. This shift is reminiscent of a seasoned sailor adjusting their course based on new currents and prevailing winds, no longer solely reliant on a fixed, potentially outdated chart. The capacity for reconciliation, both with others and, perhaps more crucially, with oneself, is revealed not as an endpoint, but as an ongoing practice, a continuous unfolding of compassion and acceptance. As we pivot towards the final reflection, it becomes evident that the true measure of resilience lies not in the absence of struggle, but in the capacity to transform adversity into wisdom. The echoes of past pain, though they may linger, no longer dictate the present or predetermine the future. Instead, they serve as a testament to the enduring human spirit, a reminder of the profound capacity for growth and renewal that resides within. The intricate tapestry of relationships, once frayed by misunderstanding and unspoken resentments, now displays a more robust and interwoven pattern, strengthened by the threads of honesty and mutual respect. This convergence of personal growth and relational repair signifies a fundamental recalibration, moving from a state of isolation to one of interconnectedness, from a narrative of victimhood to one of agency and enduring hope. The dry soil of Grey Hollow, once a symbol of barrenness and unfulfilled promises, now held the promise of a new season. Elijah Carver, standing on this land, felt the sun on his face not as a harsh judgment, but as a gentle affirmation. The journey that had begun with the grim task of saving a perceived enemy had, in its unfolding, become a profound excavation of his own soul. He had entered a landscape of resentment, a territory defined by the shadows of his father's secrets and his mother's guarded heart, and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably transformed. The old narrative, the one that had cast him as the perpetual victim, a son robbed of his rightful inheritance and his father's love, had finally been relinquished. It was a narrative that had served as a shield, yes, but also as a cage, its bars forged from his own pride and his refusal to confront the complexities of human connection. The revelation of Abigail, his half-sister, and the truth about Reuben's loyalty had been the seismic shifts that fractured the foundations of his self-perception. These were not mere pieces of information, but rather catalysts that forced a radical re-evaluation of his past, of the motivations and actions of those he had judged so harshly. He understood now that his father's life, like all lives, was a tapestry woven with threads of love, obligation, and compromise, and that to judge it solely through the lens of his own perceived injustices was to miss the larger, more human truth. This realization extended to his mother, whose silence, once a source of bitter accusation, now spoke of her own battles, her own fears, and her own deeply ingrained need to protect her son, even if that protection manifested as a harmful form of isolation. The act of leaving her photograph with Abigail was not an abdication of his lineage, but an embrace of its entirety, a recognition that all parts, even the hidden and the painful, contributed to the shape of who he was. The reconciliation with June was not a swift absolution, but a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding trust through consistent acts of vulnerability and honest communication. It was in the quiet sharing of anxieties, the open acknowledgement of fears, and the willingness to listen without judgment that their fractured bond began to mend. This ongoing effort demonstrated that true connection is not a static state, but a dynamic practice requiring continuous tending and a deep commitment to understanding. Similarly, his renewed engagement with his son, moving beyond passive observation to active curiosity and shared experience, revealed the profound impact of simply being present, of showing genuine interest in another's inner world. These relational repairs were not about erasing the past, but about building a future on a foundation of newfound honesty and mutual respect, proving that even the deepest wounds can heal with time, intention, and a willingness to truly see one another. The most significant obstacle, Elijah realized, had not been the external challenges of land or legacy, but the internal battle against his own entrenched narrative. The true enemy had been his own story, the version he had chosen to believe to shield himself from a more painful truth. The key to his liberation had always resided within him, in the quiet power of forgiveness, not just for Reuben or his father, but for himself. This realization marked the true beginning of his freedom, the moment he understood that his past did not define his present, and that the capacity for love and connection could expand to encompass even the most unexpected relationships. The dry soil of Grey Hollow, once a symbol of his emotional aridity, had been cultivated not by external forces, but by his own internal transformation. The practice of living this truth, of choosing understanding over resentment, of embracing complexity over simplistic judgment, was not an endpoint, but the continuous cultivation of a life truly lived.